Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today is a very special day because it's January 27th, 2025, exactly 80 years ago that Auschwitz was liberated. In fact, there are many ceremonies going on at Auschwitz today. Uh, and it's as International Holocaust Remembrance Day for those of us around the world. And the date was chosen because of Auschwitz liberation. But before I introduce the guests, I just have to say the war against the Jews in Europe was not over January 27th, 1945. The killing went on until the end of the victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. So we shouldn't think that this marked the end of the war. So now, after that uh, prerogative of the host, I'm going to interview our guest, Andrew Lanzo Jr., and he is going to talk about his father's memoir. And what's exciting, especially for him today, is that the memoir was just reissued today. It's called Footnote to History, and it's the story of and in his father's words, which he will explain to you, going from Hungary to America and becoming a famous cinematographer. So, Andrew, start the story by telling us about your father.
Well, my father was a great man, one of few people who survived and the only survivor of his family. He was 18 years old when he was taken to the camps.
When is
And
this? When is this?
he was taken to Bergen-Belsen in October of 1944. Before that, he had spent some time at the labor service in Kazeg, where he worked for the Germans as on forced labor starting in June of 1944.
Could you share with us, because I know you know this, why the Hungarian Jews were taken so late? Just a little, like, two sentences about how Hungary was. I didn't prepare him for it, so maybe he's not going to be so happy. How Hungary was an ally, but until events happened in the spring of 44, the Jews were left alone.
Well, Germany invaded Hungary in March of 1944. And one of the reasons a lot of Hungarians survived is therefore they didn't have as long of a time in the camps as people, let's say, from other countries like Poland. Um, the Germans, the Hungarians had fought against the Russians in World War One. And so come World War II, they were originally anti-Russian until Germany came in and took over the country, and then Germany became their enemy.
Okay, so now we've explained why the Hungarian Jews were taken late in the timeline. So now let's go back to his father.
So on that day in June when he was taken away to the labor camp, the Germans took the strong to work for their war machine, and they sent the weak and infirm, like my father's mother, to camps to be killed, like Auschwitz. My father's job at the labor camp was to lay train tracks for the Germans. And he worked very hard at that during the day, but he was a rebel. And at night, when no one was looking, he took a bucket and poured sand into the gearboxes of all the trains. And he knew that the gears would seize and the trains carrying German soldiers and supplies would be stranded on the tracks he was forced to build.
The Jews resisted. That's just one example of many, many acts of resistance that when people say, why didn't the Jews fight back? So that, thank you for sharing that story. What happened next?
So he escaped from the labor camps because he had built a knapsack that he kept with him at all times. It had hidden compartments for food, tools, and survival gear. And one day when the Allies bombed the camp, he grabbed the knapsack and headed for the woods. Those who weren't prepared, who didn't have knapsacks with them at all time, worked for the Germans until they were too weak to work, and then they were murdered. While he was running away from the camp, he got hit by a bomb fragment and an iron rod pierced his leg. He was able to pull the rod out he treated it with iodine that he had hidden in his pack, and he sutured it with the sewing kit from his pack also. In spite of that, fragments from the bomb stayed in his leg, and I felt them many times during the rest of his life.
And when was this that he escaped?
He escaped. Were you asking for the date? It would
Yeah,
have
or at
been
least that, right.
right. It would have been in August of 1944.
Okay.
And while he was free, his biggest fear was not the Nazis, but or not the German soldiers, but the Hungarian Nazi Party, also known as the Illuság. And they were more brutal than the Germans. They would kill people, even former countrymen and friends, without remorse. And for amusement, they would line Jews up on the bridge and shoot them like ducks in a galley and watch with amusement as they fell into the river one by one.
Are these the same people, monsters who shot the Jews along the River Danube in
Yes,
Budapest, where that moving memorial of the shoes?
that's what I was referring to. And so my father, he survived because of strong will, but also instinct and preparation and a good deal of luck, which I can tell you about later. But one day he was walking while he was free and he was surprised by the Neelasak. They were also known as the Arrow Cross because that's the patch they wore on their arms. But he was prepared, and rather than running away or hiding, he knew if they stopped him, he had no papers as a labor camp deserter and would have been killed on the spot. He walked right up to the squadron leader and calmly asked for directions to Verosliget. He said that the Germans had sent him there on an errand. The squadron leader pointed him in the right direction, and off he went.
Amazing, just amazing. Okay, then what happened?
So he was free until October of 1944, when he was captured and taken to the railroad station. When he
Wait,
boarded
wait,
the
how was he captured?
he was holed out in a abandoned barracks, and the Germans came and took everybody from there to and sent them to camps. But when he boarded the train, he was very smart. His instinct kicked in. He walked on the train first and stood by a small window where he'd get a breath of fresh air. He took postcards and folded them together and pushed them through the window to create a channel so rainwater could trickle in. And he had some bacon sewed in his clothes. So the doors didn't open for 10 days as they were on their way to Belsen, and many in the center of the car died from suffocation, lack of water, or were overcome by their waste products. And when I give my lectures, I tell people that you have all heard about the horrors of the camps, but what you don't know is that before they even got to the camps, survivors walked off of cars, train cars, over and above dead bodies.
I just want to say an editorial here. I'm not um, denigrating people who bring boxcars, real boxcars, as part of your museum. But unless you have I mean, I don't understand how anyone can stand in a clean boxcar and understand what it was like for 10 days, the smell, the suffocation. So I almost think it's too pure. Is that too clean an experience of the Holocaust? Uh, because what you described, I think, is very important that people understand. I'll never forget a rabbi I know said about Greek Jews, not from all parts of Greece, but in one particular place, he said, took them 10 days to get to Auschwitz. The lucky ones died before.
Well, and that's very possible. My father, in his own words, they were jammed together like sardines and they didn't sway when the car started or stopped.
So thank you for sharing that. As you know, the name of this podcast is Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. And I agree. But it really took 10 days from Budapest to Auschwitz. Well, I know
Yes.
to explain that they had to the trains kept stopping to let the German troop trains go through. People should understand that. He's telling the truth, is what I'm trying to tell you.
He didn't write about the day to day, but he was specific about it took 10 days.
And you and I before discussed that uh, Andrew's father was very specific. He in his book he says when he's not sure about something. He didn't embellish. So we'll
It
take.
was extremely accurate, Phyllis. I mean, like you said, he didn't embellish, he didn't make things up, and he was always admitted when he didn't remember something exactly. But became a cinematographer, and his mind was an artist, and he always saw the world in pictures. So his descriptions were very accurate.
So which camp was he taken to?
He was taken to Bergen-Belsen, which was not a death by gas chamber camp. It was a death by slow death from neglect. People died from starvation. They froze to death. He was there at the same time as Anne Frank,
And
who
her
is
sister.
believed to have died from being bitten to death by fleas and lice. When my father was there, his weight dropped to under 90 pounds. He was a big man. He was over 6 feet, but he never lost his humanity. He shared his bi-daily potato with a pregnant woman who he believes the child was born alive, but he isn't sure if it survived the camp. He said the woman needed it more than he did.
By do you mean every other day? Is that what you're saying?
Bi-daily, they got a potato every other day.
Yes, okay. I just wanted to clarify. And did he have to work when he was in Bergen-Belsen?
He didn't write about that.
Interesting.
The only experience he wrote about was one day a cart of dead bodies rolled by, and the person pushing it yelled out to him by a nickname that very few people knew, Bondi. And he couldn't stop and talk, but when he looked around in the distance, a starving man was staring at him. He thought it was his brother. He wrote that in the book, who was never accounted for after the war. I did some research when I did a talk at the Houston Holocaust Museum. The curator found out that his brother was at Bergen-Belsen at the same time. So it probably was his brother, and that image haunted him for the rest of his life.
I can understand that that image haunted him. So can we move forward to liberation now? Tell us about that.
To the what?
To liberation.
Okay, so he was sent away from Belsen to Theresienstadt. There were three trains that were sent from Belsen to
Oh, he
Theresienstadt.
was on one of those three trains. I just want to clarify. I always say Terezin, the Czech name, but Andrew's saying the German name. Okay, go ahead. Which
Theresienstadt.
of those three trains was he on?
So there was one that was never accounted for, and the one that I'm not sure about, Phyllis, but the one he was on was the one that the Germans had mounted anti-aircraft guns on, so the Allies bombed it. And my father and his friend Fogface ran from the bombing. They kicked the door open. When I talked about luck, his friend, who was 6 feet away from him, was hit by ordnance and blown to pieces. After the bombing, my father got back on the train because they thought they might be headed on a prisoner exchange for freedom. And before they got on the train, they threw the guns off and they painted red crosses on the roofs, and they made it to Theresienstadt, which incidentally was not a step up. It was as horrific as any camp, even though for many years it was the Germans' propaganda camp where they filmed feasts and festivals to make them look like they were very humane.
Yes, I have been to Terezin, and by the end, when they stuffed all these, it was bad enough. But when they then at the end, the Germans stuffed even more and more and more and more people in, it was really horrendous. So I think that's important to mention that though there were survivors who had never left Terezin the whole time, and others who were brought to Terezin, it was not the propaganda place that the Nazis made it out to be.
Well, when he got there, he found his father,
Really?
and his father had been beaten every day. At first, they didn't recognize each other. He had to crawl under the camps, under the barracks in a dark tunnel to get to the barracks where he had heard that there were survivors from Papa, which was the town he grew up in. At first, they didn't recognize each other, but when they did, his father, who was a big, strong war hero, he cried and sobbed just for a long time. He told my father that he had been beaten every day because he wouldn't submit, but that he had survived Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Birkenau, and a 100-mile death march to Theresienstadt, during which he had carried part of the way a friend of his who couldn't walk until the friend died in his arms. Shortly after that, his father got typhus, and my father watched them load him into an ambulance, which didn't take you to hospitals. It took you to the countryside where you could be dumped and wouldn't infect anybody else. But that was another image that stuck with him. When my father saw that, he vowed that he would kill every Nazi that he saw. But that resolve was tested very shortly, and it's one of two interesting stories from Theresienstadt. You have to stop me, Phyllis, because I could talk all day, but
Now
if
keep
you're
going.
interested in those stories,
I
I'll
will
tell you.
stop you if you keep going.
All right. So on in May of 1945, the Germans surrendered and things got worse. There was no one to bring food or water to the prisoners at Theresienstadt. My father formed a gang and they made daily forays into the countryside. On an early trip, they surprised a German officer still in uniform, a young man, and my father took his gun. And remember what he had said about killing Nazis, but he couldn't do it. He said it could have been a young man going home to see his mother. And Elie Wiesel said the same thing. He said, only the guilty are guilty. The children of killers are not killers, they're children. So he let the man go. Then on another trip, and this is the most charming story I can tell because sometimes beautiful stories are born in terrible times. They broke into a house with a piano. And in their group was Fraser Gurry, who was a famous musician from before the war. And they talked him into playing the piano, even though he was reluctant. And the song he said played was Smoke It's in Your Eyes. And my father wrote that the sounds filled the air with beauty and humanity and an indescribable joy of being alive. Then 10 years later in New York, my father was filming an event. Again, he became a cinematographer and he heard a piano. And when he walked up to it, there sat George Fayer, now with an American name. And they embraced. And he told my father that he might never have played the piano again, but for the encouragement that day in Theresienstadt. He became a famous pianist and he played Smoke It's in Your Eyes for my father again.
It is a beautiful story. But now we have to rewind because we left your father foraging in the countryside, liberated, but still no place to go and no food. So then what happened?
So the Russians liberated Theresienstadt sometime after May 1945. I don't know the exact date.
Well,
And
the Nazis had fled, but the prisoners were still there because they had no place to go. And then the
right.
Russians arrived. Okay.
And the Red Cross took over, and my father regained his strength and his weight. And by the fall, he was ready to go home. They told him to stop at the Red Cross office in Prague, where every survivor would be given 1,000 krona. But when they got there, the man behind the desk said they'd handed out all the money, but here, take 20 krona of my own funds, but please sign this registration. It was written in Czechoslovakian. He didn't think my father could read it, but he didn't know my father, who figured out he was signing a receipt for 1,000 krona. So I mentioned that my father did have a rebel streak. Later, he broke into the office and broke into the safe and found all the money and took it to the street and shared it with survivors who it was had been raised for.
That's that's a very upsetting, but also very interesting story.
So anyway, he got back to Papa and looked for
The
survivors,
town where he was born.
the town where he was born, and looked for survivors, and there were none, and none of his friends wanted much to do with him. So he decided to come to a land far away, and this is where I get emotional, that he had read about and heard about, and it was America. So to escape from the Russians, he told someone that he was going to leave from behind a certain building at a given time and date, and not to tell anybody because the Russians paid bounties of food and money for that information.
Oh, but we need to explain the Russians did not want people leaving from under their control.
Right. I'm sorry, I left that out.
Yes, many people don't know that. There's a heartbreaking movie from many, many years ago with the Israeli actor Topol, Before Winter Comes. It's the most heartbreaking of the reparations, but we're not the policy with the Russians. Okay, we're not talking about that, but I did want to explain why he has to do this. Okay, go ahead.
So anyway, his plan worked because when the time came, the Russians were waiting for him, but he had left 3 or 4 days earlier. So he made his way across Europe, walking, hitchhiking on a stolen motorcycle till he got to Ulm, Germany, where he applied for immigration to the United States. He applied as a Yugoslav because they had a higher quota, and sure enough, his petition was granted in 6 months, but many Hungarians waited for over 5 years. To do well in the interview, he traded all of his valuable possessions, everything he had left, to a dentist to fix his teeth to make himself look healthy. He read everything he could about America so he would sound informed, and he did push-ups and sit-ups every day so he would look strong.
What would we say? A Yiddish cup? I mean, it's brilliant. Okay. And it
And
worked, right?
it did. And when he left Bremen Harbor on December 31st, 1946, all he had was the suit on his back that he had sewn from a U.S. Army blanket and the pictures and photos that I use when I give my PowerPoint presentation around the country. When he stepped on the SS Ernie Pyle, which is the boat that took him, he swore that he would never talk about his past again.
That's interesting.
When he arrived in New York Harbor, he had $2 in his pocket and didn't speak English.
But he
But we
spoke,
found
wait, mention how many languages he did speak.
he spoke Hungarian, Russian, and German. And later in his career as a cinematographer, when he filmed Shogun, in the 6 months leading up to it, he learned how to speak Japanese. So
Amazing.
he could understand what the crew talked, even though he never let on that he could understand them.
Okay, at this point, and eventually, of course, he learned English, but at this point, he didn't know English. He arrives in the harbor of New York. Okay.
And somewhere we have a picture of the Ernie Pyle coming into New York Harbor with him on it. And his mind, I think, at that time was transitioning from the terror to just the great adventure that lay ahead of him.
And how did he become a famous cinematographer? Okay, got that word.
Okay, he was drafted in the U.S. Army. By the way, he learned English by sitting in a movie theater and watching Gunga Din over and over again, 10 hours a day. And after a month, he spoke English without much of an accent. But he was drafted into the Signal Corps and learned the art of motion picture photography. And that's where luck started to kick in. His unit was assigned to film the nuclear tests in the Nevada desert. As a Hungarian, he was a security risk and couldn't go. And that upset him. But 6 months later, everybody else in his unit, and I have a picture of his unit, was dead. They had died from leukemia. They were too close to the detonations and didn't understand radiation poisoning. So he got his first job in the movie business on the Phil Silvers show. And you look like you're as old as I am, so you probably know about Sergeant Bilko. But he showed up on the set on a Friday looking for work, and it so happened there was a new piece of camera equipment that no one could run. They asked him, and he said he was the best there was. And they said, come Monday and we'll give you a job and give you a chance, actually. And of course, he'd never seen the equipment and never heard of it. but he hid in the studio over the weekend and practiced with the equipment. And by Monday, he was the best there was.
Amazing, amazing. And then what happened?
Well, I'm going to skip over some of the other stories, but if we have time, I'll come back. Ed Sullivan hired him to film Fidel Castro in the first interview when he was coming out of the mountains. When they arrived in Cuba, none of their equipment worked. It was the wrong electrical standard. My father filmed the 10-minute interview by putting his finger in the reel and advancing the film by hand. And the interview was good enough that nobody noticed for 10 minutes when it was on national TV. And Ed Sullivan thanked him on national TV, said he was the only man who could do it. You can actually see that, a YouTube video of Ed Sullivan thanking my father and showing the video. It's on YouTube.
Okay, so wait, because this is a program about the Holocaust, I want to know when your father broke his resolve of never talking about it. And when
Oh,
and also about you growing up, did you know about it?
great story, great question. So 50 years to the date that he arrived in New York Harbor on January 17th, 1997, a book arrived at our doorstep that he had written over 10 years and bound himself in the basement, and it was his memoirs. And so when I read it, that was the first time. I was 45. My mother didn't even know about his history either,
Wait,
because
wait, wait. You mean he wrote this memoir in secret and you didn't know that he was writing it?
right.
Okay, keep going.
And so uh, what was my reaction well, why did he keep it a secret? Well, maybe he didn't want to relive his past. Maybe he didn't want it to define our lives. Maybe he wanted us to have the carefree youth he didn't. And very possibly he thought it was too much for us. He didn't want us to be victims and grow up with a chip on our shoulder. And he might have been right. When my 14-year-old daughter read the book, she had a panic attack and couldn't breathe, and we had to take her to the hospital. But anyway, my first reaction was shock because, I had seen Holocaust pictures my whole life and never paid much attention to them. And then I felt incredibly foolish because looking back, there were so many signs I should have recognized.
Can you give
So
us an example?
he once we were at a restaurant and he ate everything on his plate except for the beets, which were delicious, delicious. And I asked him why, and he said he was forced to eat beets on April 20th. And I asked him why, what was the matter with that? And he said that was Hitler's birthday. Plus, Phyllis, he was so compulsively prepared for everything. When we traveled, he had money sewed into his clothes. His toilet kit contained water purification pills, medicines, and enough instruments to do minor surgery. When the hurricanes came to New York, which is where we were living when I was young, he filled all of the bathtubs and sinks with water and built a still in our basement so he could refine it. And once I told him I didn't think he could build a fire without matches, and that was a mistake because 10 minutes later he had torn his shirt and rubbed two sticks together and built a fire. And he said that was the easy way, hard way. And I said, what was the easy way? He took off his glasses and concentrated the sun onto some dry glass and built a fire in just 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds maybe, to be
But you,
accurate.
but wait, you did know he was from Hungary. You must have, or not. Did you not know where he?
Yes, we knew he was from Hungary. He had told us that a bomb had hit their house and his whole family had died.
That's
And
what he told you.
yeah, he told us. And one of my brothers suspected that maybe he didn't want to talk about it because he had fought on the wrong side.
You thought he'd fought in the war.
He possibly on the wrong side.
No, I
And
understood that part. It was that the fact that you actually thought he was a soldier. That's what's really interesting.
and so anyway, he shared his secret. I got over the shock and I called him on the phone. He was in New York and I was in Montana where I live now. And it was awkward because how do you start that conversation? I didn't know what to say, and I know he was scared or kind of apprehensive. But after a little, we never had the greatest relation. But after a little of small talk, I told him that I loved him and was proud to be his son. And it was the first time in my life I ever heard him cry.
That is real. I mean, it's starting to make me. And then what did you say? Then how did that conversation go?
We immediately planned a trip to Hungary to look at all the spots that he had written about in his book. And 2 weeks later, we were walking around. When I say we, I mean myself, my brothers and sister, and my mother. She had found out about, 3 months before we did because she proofread his memoir. We visited the home he grew up in, the train station where he was taken away, the synagogue, which was in ruins. And there were two especially memorable things that happened on the trip. It was Hungarian Remembrance Week, a Holocaust Remembrance Week in Hungary. And I told
Wait,
him
is
that
that or it's a different time of the year?
that was, I don't know, I don't remember the exact date, but it would have been sometime in March or April.
So I'm saying that it's a different time than, okay, keep going.
Yes. And so I told him that I was glad they were trying to do something, and he didn't really like that. He took me by the arm around the corner and showed me something that he had noticed and I hadn't, which was a fresh swastika painted on the ivy. And he told me that I was the oldest son and must always be vigilant because the hatred would never go away. But the highlight was we visited his old home, and there was a little chapel in it. And behind the chapel, there was the Star of David. And that made me emotional because here was some evidence that my father, who had told us he was Catholic to possibly protect us and watched his kids raised as Episcopals, was actually a Jew.
Oh, you mean you didn't know your father was Jewish?
No, he told us he was Roman Catholic. And, he always identified as a Hungarian, even though in his book he explained that his family was Jewish on both sides, and everything that signified when you were in Hungary at that time. Part of his family had pushed to convert to protect themselves, but it really didn't work because the Nazi policy was that anybody who had one drop of Jewish blood going back 4 generations was deemed to be a Jew and targeted for extermination.
So I didn't realize until now, almost at the end of the interview, that you didn't even know that he had been born Jewish. That's really interesting.
That interesting, confusing. There's just a lot that is attached to that.
So as we get near the end of our conversation, what would you say to young people today who know really nothing about the Holocaust and don't understand that anti-Semitism today, and this is, of course, my preaching, threatens not just Jews, but anyone who lives in a democracy and wants the democracy to continue? And I'm not talking politics. I'm simply talking ideology.
So it's a great question, and that leads me right into one of the quotes from my lecture. Um, I show the picture of the open pit at Bergen-Belsen where my father wasn't, but his brother probably was,
Buried.
and buried that he walked past every day. And I tell people that in the future that could be you or me or anyone who's deemed undesirable by a totalitarian regime. And I tell them that the picture of the open pit at Belsen is the end game when one ideology controls all branches of government and the free press if good people don't speak out from the beginning. That's how I phrase that. But the reason I give lectures around the country is that it's my father survived and his survival gave me the gift of life. So it's my obligation to be strong and share the story and help keep it from happening again because it certainly could happen again.
Yes, it certainly could, especially when people do not learn history.
Right.
So I thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on the show. I will include the link to his father's book on the description of this podcast. And it's not an associate link. I don't get any money for it. So I'm just recommending the book. And I'm particularly recommending the publisher of this reissue, Amsterdam Publishers, because I am very uh, impressed by the editor in chief's goal of preserving all this history. And especially today, an International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And as I've been ending my new playlist episodes, Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust, I say that to honor the victims and the rescuers, may their memories be a blessing forever.